Alright, so the 4.2 update for Honkai Star Rail released recently, and with it came a new batch of Novaflares, making it the third time that this has happened for the game. I would say that overall these updates are generally pretty well received, because if you somehow don't know, the whole idea behind them in short form is that they're intended to make some characters stronger than they previously were. Or at least that's what we thought way back when it was announced at the 2nd anniversary. Since that time, at least personally, I don't think that's really turned out to be the case, and I feel like it's become increasingly obvious that every time one of these Novaflares has happened, it's been done with a very specific agenda in mind. Alongside that, as more and more of them have been released, it's also become pretty clear that not all Novaflares are created equal to each other, whether that be in the attention they get during beta cycles, the changes their kits actually receive, or even what the point of the buff they got was. To put all this another way, each and every Novaflare that's been released so far, at least in my opinion, has had a different purpose than simply just making the character stronger. And honestly, I think there's actually a lot of reasons that this has been happening, from Hoyo wanting the characters changed so that they work with the new teams that they're releasing, or they wanted to update units so that they require new teammates to function by designing them to fit certain archetypes, and let's be real here, there's kind of been some blatant favoritism too. So what I wanted to do today was kind of go through the different Novaflares that have released so far, very briefly discuss how the kits have turned out long term, and also discuss a couple of big questions, like why has all this been happening, and also what does this mean for future Novaflares? So let's talk about it. First and foremost, I think it is absolutely worth repeating what I said earlier in this video. Not every Novaflare is created equal, so while some of them have gotten the short end of the stick per se because Hoyo had a specific idea in mind for them, the opposite can be, and well, is absolutely true too. At least in my opinion, this is mostly what's caused the varying levels of strength and the impact that the Novaflares have had on the characters that got them. And with that out of the way, so far at least, there have been 10 individual characters that have gotten Novaflares so far, which are Blade, Jingliu, Silverwolf, and Kafka for the first batch, Sparkle and Black Swan for the second, and lastly the most recent one with Welt, Huohuo, Firefly, and Seele. To keep it super simple, when I'm talking about them in this video, I'm going to go through them in the batches that they were released in. So let's talk about batch 1 first. Out of all 3 Novaflares, honestly, I would say that this batch is the most, I don't even really know how to put it, like average, I guess? Like when you look at the endgame clears and how functional the characters are right now, all 4 of the characters are undoubtedly at least a little bit better than they were originally in the case of some of them, and much better in the case of others. But with that said, despite the variance between them all, apart from Kafka specifically, none of them excel at any specific thing. For example, let's look at Blade and Jingliu first. Both of these characters were changed from dual scaling in the case of Blade and full attack scaling in the case of Jingliu to be entirely HP scalers after their buff. And at the time at least, this resulted in both of them pretty much having identical teams using the old Hyacine Tribby Sunday wheelchair. At the same time though, this is when the earlier Remembrance team was starting to be built around Castorise, considering she just released with the 3.2 update, which immediately started causing problems for both Blade and Jingliu. In Jingliu's case, really, after her buff, she ended up almost like a budget version of Castorise herself. They both have mechanics where they drain HP from the team, and they also gain something out of doing that, with stacks in the case of Jingliu and ult in the case of Castorise, but Cass ended up getting a lot more value out of those ults than, well, Jingliu's entire kit as a whole did. I mean, what, you're telling me that this was ever going to be comparable to this?
Know your fucking place, trash.
Alongside that, due to the changes with her traces that gave Jingliu an excessive amount of crit damage, her stats are super easy to oversaturate, and therefore she gets less value out of buffs offered by her teammates. So all in all, this resulted in her pretty much getting immediately pushed to the side in favor of, just running Castorise. On the other hand, in Blade's case, he's actually fared a little bit better than Jingliu did because he doesn't really have the stat oversaturation that she does, and honestly, as a whole, his kit kind of flows really well between the different parts of it. But right now at least, he has 2 major power spikes that make him actually, go from kind of just whatever to actually semi-viable. One of them is from his E1, which while relatively obtainable now as he's in the 50-50 loss pool, does mean that without it, his damage suffers. And the other is Hyacine, or more specifically her Light Cone, as that gives him more stacks for his follow-ups. So basically, what Blade is left with is that at E0 without Hyacine, he's a character that doesn't really hold up at all to any of the current HP meta characters, and while he's better if he does have those things, he is still sadly worse than Castorise, despite again at the time requiring basically the exact same supports. And to be clear here, I'm talking about back then, meaning, when Castorise and Blade and Jingliu and all them were competing for Hyacine and Tribby, rather than right now, where Castorise has stuff like Cyrene and Evernight and, that kind of stuff. So, in short, both of them had issues because, for a lack of a better way to put it, they were shoved into an archetype that was already being heavily catered to one specific character, and then as time has gone on and more characters of that archetype have been released, like Cyrene and Evernight like I just mentioned, they both kind of got pushed to the side in favor of them. And as a result of all this, both of them didn't really end up having a real place in the game, but you know, hey, Blade has a new form coming soon, and surely he doesn't get screwed twice, right? Right? So apart from those two, during batch 1, there was also Silverwolf that got a buff. She's a debuffer, and while she is absolutely a solid character, it's not really possible to say that she is a best in slot team, well, anywhere. With high investment, for example at E2, she does actually become Acheron's best in slot support, but I mean, let's be real here. Acheron is completely in the dumps right now, so being her support, well, yeah, that's not really worth anything. I mean, hell, Welt is a better DPS at this point, which is, well, I mean, yeah. So I mean, that's 3 out of the 4 characters of that Novaflare batch that ended up not really having any kind of place that they excel at least in the current state of the game. Both of the DPS characters with Blade and Jingliu ended up getting shoved to the side by Castoris, and even more so by Evernight and Cyrene, so there's not really a real point of using them anymore assuming that you have those other characters, and the support character with Silverwolf, while good, doesn't really have a team where she's best in slot. But with that said, that does leave Kafka as the one leftover character that actually is in a great spot considering she's the cornerstone of the dot meta after her buffs. Basically, instead of being the main driver for dot, she was turned into an almost supportive kind of role. And with that said, the reality of her buffs is that it was pretty much necessary for them to happen so that dot could, you know, function, because I mean, let's be real here, dot was in a really rough spot beforehand. Sure, they could have made a new character like Super Break got with Dahlia, but it is a hell of a lot easier to change some numbers than to make an entirely new character, and if they didn't, then other characters that were released after the buffs, like Hycelin's, would have been relatively pointless. So with all that said, what's the reasoning, right? Like, Kafka's case is pretty obvious because she was necessary for the dot archetype to actually work, but what's the reasoning behind changing Blade and Jingliu and making changes to their scalings? Or why buff Silverwolf but not really give her a niche that she excels at? And really, for all these characters, even including Kafka, well, I don't actually think it was for them. See, if you think about it, making these changes only makes players excited about, you know, playing the characters again. And if you want to make them playable, then you're going to need to either get whatever characters they play with, or get them if you have the characters they play with, but not them. Like the Jingliu that you rolled all the way back in 1.4, well, they're not playable anymore without their new HP scaling team. Blade is going to want the same supports like Hyacine and Tribby even more than he did before. Kafka is now functionally necessary for dot teams to, you know, actually be able to function. And Silverwolf, well, I guess you could say she's somewhat of an outlier, but reminder, she's an option for archer teams even if she's not the outright best. So really, if you remember what I said at the beginning of this video, most of the time there's a goal in mind with these buffs, right? Like if Kafka is playable, then you're more inclined to invest in dot for the first time in over a year and roll Hycelin's. If Jingliu and Blade want new teammates that also just so happen to work with the new HP meta, well then they're basically the access road into that meta. And to be clear here, I'm not trying to say anything along the lines of, ooh hoo hoo, Hoyo is out here trying to mind game players into rolling like some nefarious overlord or anything like that. At the end of the day, it is up to players to choose who they want to roll for, but at the same time, it's also hard to deny that it does create a level of pressure to roll for all these other different things. Like in an ideal world, Jingliu would have just gotten direct buffs to her attack scaling kit that fixed her issues with stat oversaturation, for example, so that she was still playable in that mode. But by changing her in the way that they did, they essentially made her a worse version of the more premier HP units, and she was very, very easily replaceable by them. So basically what I'm saying is that while these characters are better, they also were pretty clearly designed to at the very least nudge players in a certain direction. But with that said, at the end of the day, they did end up better than they were before, so, you know, there's that, I guess. Before moving forward, if you've been enjoying my yaps so far, well, I'd appreciate if you could drop a like on the video and also subscribe to the channel. It does help out a lot, and I mean, hey, it'd be pretty cool if you did. And now, on to the second batch of Novaflares. This one was a smaller batch released with 4.0 and the new Elation path with 2 characters getting buffed, which are Sparkle and Black Swan. But despite being a smaller batch, both of the characters here were received extremely well. For Sparkle, she's now considered one of the better hypercarry supports and also extremely strong in certain teams, rivaling and even beating Sunday and the RMC in some cases. On top of that, all the buffs she got fixed fundamental problems with her kit, for example like allowing the skill points that she gains from her ultimate to be stored for use later, or changing the damage boost that her ult used to give into a pseudo vulnerability ability that more teams could use. All in all, it really propelled her up into meta relevance, and it's hard to find fault with what they did with her Novaflare. Black Swan actually fared very well too, becoming an extremely potent dot DPS when paired with the previously buffed Kafka, who turned into a support, as well as the semi-recently released Hysolins, who can easily help Black Swan build her Arcana stacks due to how many different dots that she provides on the enemies. Alongside that, the buff helped push her back into meta relevance for a team that didn't really have a third unit for it, considering most of the other options were underpowered. But again, remember, there is always a reason for these. I mean, sure, you can look at characters like Black Swan and Sparkle and say, I mean, yeah, they suck and they should be stronger. But there's a lot of characters like that, right? I mean, we live in a world where our first anniversary character Akron is considered a bad unit right now. And I mean, she hasn't been buffed yet, right? So when you look at these two characters, you also have to look beyond the fact that they were just simply bad and look more towards why they specifically were chosen for this batch. Similar to Kafka, I think Black Swan's reasoning is relatively simple. Prior to her buff, most people were running Cyrene with Kafka and Hysolins because of a weird interaction between the two of them. But that was definitely not something that was like the intended way to play Dot. So, Dot players were left in a bit of a weird spot. Players with Kafka and Black Swan but no Hysolins would feel forced to roll Hysolins so that they could actually play their Kafka with a strong DPS, and players that had Kafka and Hysolins but no Black Swan were actually missing a third party member to work with them. So, if you look at the buff itself that Black Swan got, it pretty much solved both of those problems by directly tying her into the team with both of them. Like, even after the buff, Kafka and Black Swan is actually weaker than Kafka and Hysolins, but when you pair Hysolins with Black Swan and then obviously Kafka, then like I said earlier, Black Swan gets her Arcana stacks much quicker, and therefore it created a triple synergy between the three of them. Hysolins creates a ton of different dots, which then helps build Black Swan's stacks, which then is procced by Kafka, and the whole cycle repeats endlessly. The result of all this is that they basically became three parts of the same whole. While sure, you can make do with only Kafka and one of the dot DPSs, the performance significantly increases with all three of them to the point that players are heavily incentivized to roll for all three if they do actually want to play dot. And I mean, to be clear here, I am not trying to say that it's unplayable if you don't have all three, but the intent was pretty clear when Black Swan got her buffs, and also considering how infrequent we actually get dot characters, I'm sure it'll be the only change that the dot niche gets as a whole for quite a while. On the other hand, for Sparkle, at least personally, I think the goal with her buffs was to give players an early avenue into getting into the Elation meta. Like, there's not really a reason that Sparkle's damage bonus from her ultimate needed to change to the pseudo-vulnerability that I mentioned earlier, until you think about the fact that the new path we got with 4.0 came with an entirely new damage type, which was, well, Elation. And because it's a new damage type, the only things that can actually buff it are direct Elation damage percent buffs, which are very uncommon right now, or basic stuff like Death Shred, Respent, and of course, the vulnerability that Sparkle got. While it has been a couple patches since Elation released at this point, at least early into the 4.x cycle, she was pretty much the best in slot for Sparksy and Yao Guang teams, but now that we're farther into the patch cycle and people have gotten comfortable with the mechanics of the path and both Evanescence and Silverwolf 999 have been released, I mean, yeah, she's actually already been filtered out of most of the teams. Like right now at least, Evanescence mostly wants Yao Guang in the EMC, Silverwolf 999 wants Sparksy and Yao Guang, and even Sparksy herself, who was originally played with Sparkle as a DPS, has found herself more in a sub-DPS role and not really using Sparkle that much either. So for all those people that invested into Sparkle, she was almost like a gateway into getting into the new Elation meta, and also she was what people used as a stopgap to get to where we are right now with more characters being released specifically for that meta. And to be clear here, I'm not trying to say that Sparkle is somehow bad now because she's no longer frequently used in Elation teams. In fact, she's still a great unit. I mean, just look at Archer clears. But again, we're looking at the reasoning behind the buffs, and personally, I think that the reasoning was mostly what I said just a bit ago. She got people into the new meta, and now that they're in, they invest further. Just as another quick example, we've actually already seen this happen back in 3.x, where we had Tribby released early on that was really good for the HP meta, but nowadays she's not really used in those teams at all anymore. So all in all, for this batch of Novaflares, what really happened was they got them to push a certain archetype, Dot in the case of Black Swan and Elation in the case of Sparkle. While both of these characters are faring pretty well right now, I do still think it's important to recognize the reasoning that they got buffed so that players can essentially be aware of what they're getting into when they invest into one character or another, even more so during a Novaflare. And finally, onto the most recent Novaflares, Batch 3. If Batch 1 of Novaflares was considered average and Batch 2 was considered great, honestly, the only thing I can really say about Batch 3 is that it's, well, it's wild to say the least. Like, it's probably one of the most polarizing groups that we've gotten so far. We've got characters like the God King Welt.
That's what I'm talking about! That's why he's the MVP! That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
but also Huohuo, who barely got any changes at all, and Seele, who kinda just ended up with mostly multiplier changes apart from her extra skill activation. As a result of the major differences between Novaflares, this one is kinda hard to find an overarching reason for the buffs to happen, but I think at least two of them, being Welt and Firefly, came from a place of favoritism. Firefly is the more obvious one. I mean, she's got an entire archetype pretty much entirely dedicated to her with Super Break, and more recently, an entire character designed specifically for her with Dahlia. She's also one of the very few characters that have gotten a skin, and despite being actually pretty damn strong pre-Novaflare, assuming again that you have Dahlia, well, she got one anyway. It kinda goes without saying that she's a community favorite too, so I mean, really, I don't really see another option as to why she of all people actually got one here other than, you know, favoritism. The sad thing with it though really is that it didn't necessarily solve any of her kit's problems. Like without Dahlia, she still has energy issues, and while sure it's nice that she gets to stay in her sand form longer even if you don't have Dahlia, the problem wasn't really ever that, at least in my opinion. Even just looking at damage numbers, again, without Dahlia, her issue of having to, you know, actually break the enemy hasn't changed either. And as a result of all this, it kind of felt almost undeserved in a sense, because there are so many characters that actually needed a Novaflare instead of her. But don't tell the Firefly mains I said that. Like, does it make sense to buff Firefly with kind of mid buffs, to be real, just because she's a community favorite? Or does it make sense to buff one of the characters that actually need it to fix their kits? And in a somewhat similar vein, ever since we saw Welt back in beta, I've said all along that if Welt makes it through unscathed, then it's because Dwayne himself played HSR and was like, hey, why does my OC Welt suck right now? But in seriousness, I think the actual reason is again somewhat related to favoritism, or at the very least flavor of the month characters. And what I mean by that is that pretty much all of the Express crew have gotten something to help them stay relevant, and all of them have had an impactful role on playing Arcadia. March has had 2 forms released post-launch, Dan is the same, obviously the Trailblazers had multiple forms released, and Himiko, while she hasn't gotten a new form yet, there have been some rumblings that she may get one soon due to her importance on playing Arcadia, and even discounting those rumors, she is still more than playable right now in break teams. On the other hand, pre-buff Welt kinda had nothing, so at least in my eyes, the buffs to Welt came from a place of wanting to give him something, even if it's not an alternate form like most of the rest of the Astro Express crew got, or may get. Did he need to end up as absolutely busted as he is? I mean, no, let's be real, it's kinda crazy that a standard character of all thing arguably has had the best Novaflare across all 10 characters, but I do think it was from a place of caring about Welt as a character and therefore favoritism like I've been mentioning. And all in all, it's definitely not a bad thing for players either. Mine is at E4 right now, but I know for damn sure he's staying in my 50-50 loss pool until he's at E6. With all that said, apart from the favoritism with Firefly and Welt, that leaves Seele, who, I don't know, honestly feels like she kinda just didn't get enough. Frankly, apart from appeasing the players that have wanted Seele to be buffed, she's probably the one exception in this whole list of Novaflare characters where I'm just not really sure what the goal was. Like, she is undoubtedly better than she was before, but the biggest problem with characters like Seele, in my opinion, is that she doesn't really have anywhere that she excels at, sorta similar to Blade and Jingliu and Silverwolf from earlier. In Seele's case though, it's actually a little bit worse here, right? Like, if you look at Blade and Jingliu, even though their Novaflares didn't make them long-term meta relevant, it did put them in a scenario where as long as the HP meta is thriving, they'll at least be alright. Seele, on the other hand, isn't really a part of any kind of meta, so I just don't really know if I can say the same. I mean, yeah, she is absolutely better, but will that remain the case when she doesn't get any future support, whether that be from the content being designed around her, or a team specifically built for her, or anything else of that sort? So I mean, again, this is honestly the one Novaflare that's a big question mark in my eyes, because I don't entirely know what the point of it was. With the game in its current state, characters that don't have a niche that they fit into definitely struggle, and they struggle big. So honestly, I really don't see a world where Seele lasts long term despite the fact that she just got a buff. And lastly, with Huohuo, well, she kinda takes the cake home in terms of weird or honestly even bad Novaflares. Similar to Seele, she is better, and even before her buff she was playable, but her entire Novaflare ended up so stunted because she was so clearly designed for one thing and one thing only, and that was to be a stopgap where she's just barely good enough to hold Elation players over until the premium Elation sustain releases sometime in the future, whether that be with Pearl or a new alternate version of someone or whatever else. So, unfortunately, apart from the God King Welt, I truly feel like this batch of Novaflares in particular was almost wasted, because I mean, if only 1/4 of the buffs were actually meaningful for the characters and their long-term playability, then it doesn't really bode well for the system as a whole in my eyes. And that right there is a perfect segue to talk about the most important takeaway from all of this discussion. What is actually the point of Novaflares, and why is the point of them a problem? Really, when you look at Novaflares at face value, they are good. I think that is an undeniable fact. I have always been someone that has advocated for buffs all the way back since I first started my YouTube channel and first started making content. So even though there's a lot of caveats with this Novaflare system, I do think at its core it does help with dealing with the power creep the game has at least a little bit, and it also allows people to play their older, underutilized characters for a longer period of time, which is undoubtedly good. Like without Novaflares, Jingliu and Blade probably wouldn't even be 5 cycling right now. Without a Novaflare, Welt probably wouldn't be used at all. Without a Novaflare, Dot wouldn't be clearing content. So with all that said, I mean, yeah, Novaflares are nice. But with that said, it is definitely not all sunshine and roses here. Almost every single Novaflare character has been buffed with the express goal of pushing not just the character getting buffed into some form of meta relevance, but also something else alongside them. Whether it's Elation with Sparkle and Huohuo, or Dot with Kafka and Black Swan, or even just the waifu push characters like Firefly, they all don't really feel free, if that makes any sense. Like sure, your characters are better, but when a cost is attached to them that basically says you need these other characters to play them, or this buff is intended for this specific team and stuff like that, then it doesn't really feel like a buff and more like a push towards doing something. And I mean, who can blame him? I mean, hell, I've played into it myself. Like, I wouldn't own Sunday on my account if it weren't for Blade and Jingliu getting Novaflares where I specifically got him to play with them. So yes, I absolutely cannot deny the fact that characters getting buffed is great. I do have to say that I'm not a huge fan of the fact that it doesn't feel like we're actually getting the buffs for us, and more so that we're getting them for other reasons instead. And I do want to be absolutely clear here, I recognize the fact that this video might be coming across as pessimistic, and I won't deny that it, kind of is. But I also want to be clear that it's not without reason. I have mentioned this in a lot of my older videos, but I have played plenty of gacha games that do just straight up buff characters. There are no caveats, there is no nuance, it is literally just as simple as, this character is stronger now, and if you like him, you get to play him. So basically what I'm saying is that I know it's possible for that kind of buff to happen. Not every buff needs to have something attached to it, and honestly, despite Seele being kind of the odd one out of all the characters that have gotten Novaflared so far, she's about as close to that as we've ever gotten. So really, I guess what I'm saying with all this is that I want what happened with Seele's buff to happen with future Novaflares too, but obviously a little bit better in terms of, giving characters that don't have a niche or whatever else. Like, let's quickly use Argentia as an example. He has so many fundamental problems with his kit, like poor multipliers, difficulty in generating energy, and extremely poor vertical investment, to name a few different ones. As a result of all that, his only real use case right now is being a win set AoE slave for the Herda. So imagine if he gets buffed, and instead of fixing those fundamental problems that I mentioned, they just double down on him being a Herda slave and you don't get to play him the way that you actually want to. On the other hand, if they do fix those problems and make him a character that can stand on his own 2 legs without having to support another unit, then at least personally I would find that a hell of a lot more interesting. But only time will tell, and for now at least, I do have to say that I am happy Novaflares are still happening despite the flaws that they do have right now. Despite my criticisms, I do hope that they continue to happen at a relatively consistent speed, and more so, I also hope that they don't completely write off characters, for example like Jingliu, just because she got one fix a year ago. But anyway, that's all my thoughts, and I appreciate you listening if you made it this far. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on the Novaflare system, so feel free to leave a comment down below or join my Discord link down in the description to talk with me about it. As usual, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.